Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, a vast dominion of ice and fire, where empires clashed and time itself seemed to move unevenly. In its palaces, gold glittered beneath chandeliers. In its villages, millions of peasants toiled in mud and hunger. For centuries, this imbalance had held, maintained by the autocratic will of the Tsar. Yet beneath the surface, the empire's bones were beginning to crack. The year 1905 was the first tremor. War with Japan had humiliated the Tsar's army and his people's faith in divine authority. On a winter morning in St. Petersburg, peaceful workers carrying icons and petitions were gunned down outside the Winter Palace. Bloody Sunday, they called it. For the first time, Russians saw the emperor not as a protector, but as a tyrant cloaked in faith. That day, the monarchy's sacred aura bled into the snow. The uprising that followed shook the empire from Warsaw to Vladivostok. Peasants torched estates, soldiers mutinied, and the industrial heart of Russia went silent. In panic, Nicholas II made concessions: a constitution, an elected parliament, the Duma. Yet his reforms were hollow. The Tsar dissolved the Duma whenever it displeased him and ruled by decree when convenient. What emerged was neither monarchy nor democracy, but a fragile, angry hybrid sustained by fear. Beneath this uneasy calm, old hierarchies endured. 80% of the empire's people were peasants still bound to land they didn't own. Factories in Moscow and St. Petersburg devoured their labor, paying starvation wages. The church preached obedience while the secret police silenced dissent. Meanwhile, underground cells of socialists, anarchists, and liberals whispered in the alleys, voices that would soon erupt into revolution. Nicholas II, the last of the Romanovs, was neither cruel nor cunning, but perhaps worse, he was blind. He believed his people loved him as their little father, even as riots, strikes, and assassinations proved otherwise. In the marble halls of the Winter Palace, he prayed and wrote tender letters to his wife Alexandra, while beyond the walls, the empire he ruled began to rot. By 1914, discontent simmered in every province, every factory, every village. Russia's rapid industrial growth brought no prosperity to its workers. Its new middle class demanded reform, but found none. The nobility, fearful of losing privilege, clung to the Tsar. All it needed was a spark, and that spark came not from within, but from Europe's powder keg. When the guns of August roared in 1914, Nicholas II marched his empire to war, not to defend his people, but to preserve his dynasty's pride. He rode before cheering crowds, believing unity had been restored. Yet the empire was already exhausted, its foundations brittle. The war that was meant to save the monarchy would instead destroy it. The Russian Empire, proud, ancient, and vast, entered the First World War not as a nation reborn, but as a dying giant marching toward its own funeral. When Russia entered the Great War in 1914, few realized it would become a catastrophe greater than any in the nation's history. The Tsar's armies, millions strong, vast as the steppes themselves, marched westward with icons and hymns, believing in a holy crusade. But belief could not fill empty rifles, nor feed hungry men. Within months, the dream of swift victory turned into a nightmare of slaughter. The Russian army faced a modern, mechanized Germany with weapons from another century. Poorly trained, poorly equipped, soldiers often went into battle without rifles, ordered to pick up weapons from the fallen. Communication broke down, railways choked with chaos, and officers, relics of noble privilege, clashed with men who no longer believed in them. By the end of 1915, over 2 million Russian soldiers were dead or missing. The front lines dissolved into mud, blood, and disillusionment. Far from the battlefield, the home front suffered no less. The empire's primitive transport system failed to deliver food to cities. Bread lines stretched for miles. Fuel vanished in winter. Peasants, already weary of war requisitions, withheld their grain in quiet rebellion. Factories fell silent, not from strikes this time, but from starvation. Women and children scavenged through frozen streets, while soldiers wrote home begging for boots and bullets. At the center of it all stood Nicholas II, stubbornly convinced that divine right could substitute for leadership. In 1915, he made a fatal decision. He took personal command of the army. The Tsar became directly responsible for every defeat, every body frozen in the snow. Back in Petrograd, the Empress Alexandra ruled in his absence, guided by the strange monk who haunted her chambers, Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin's influence, real or rumored, poisoned what little faith remained in the monarchy. Ministers were dismissed on his whim, generals replaced, policies rewritten. Newspapers whispered of scandal, of debauchery and treason in the palace. To the people, it seemed the empire was not ruled by God's anointed sovereign, but by a deranged mystic and a foreign-born empress. The war, the hunger, the humiliation, all were blamed on them. By 1916, the soldiers were no longer fighting for victory, but for survival. They dug trenches not to conquer, but to hide. Letters from the front spoke of despair and mutiny. Entire regiments refused to advance, while deserters flooded homeward with rifles slung over their shoulders. The war had devoured not only Russia's men, but its faith, its patience, its will to endure. The empire's collapse was no longer a question of if, only when. The battlefield had become a mirror reflecting the rot at the nation's core. Nicholas prayed for deliverance. His people prayed for bread. And as winter returned to the starving cities of 1917, Petrograd's streets began to fill again. Not with soldiers marching to war, but with women demanding food. The spark that would consume the empire was about to be struck. It began fittingly with hunger. On March 8, 1917, International Women's Day, tens of thousands of women in Petrograd marched for bread, peace, and dignity. What started as a protest soon became a movement. The next day, factory workers joined them. Within 48 hours, the entire capital was paralyzed. Smoke from idle chimneys drifted over a sea of banners and red flags. No one realized it yet, but the 300-year rule of the Romanovs had entered its final week. The Tsar, as always, was absent, commanding his doomed armies hundreds of miles away. He received reports of minor disturbances, unaware that his capital had slipped from his grasp. Police stations were overrun. Soldiers, cold, starving, long unpaid, were ordered to fire on the demonstrators. Many refused. Some even turned their rifles around. By the third day, mutiny spread through the garrisons. The Tsar's loyal regiments joined the crowds they were sent to suppress. The Duma, Russia's elected assembly, saw its chance. Liberal politicians who had once begged for reform now demanded revolution. As mobs filled the streets, the Duma declared a provisional government to restore order, but it was order without obedience, law without power. At the same time, workers and soldiers formed their own council, the Petrograd Soviet. Two governments emerged, one claiming legitimacy, the other claiming loyalty. Russia was split between the old world and the new. On March 15th, as his train rolled through a frozen landscape, Nicholas II received word that both the army and the Duma had turned against him. Even his generals, once pillars of loyalty, pleaded with him to abdicate. In a quiet rail car, the Tsar signed away his crown, not only for himself, but for his sickly son. He offered the throne to his brother, Grand Duke Michael, who refused. The dynasty that had ruled Russia since the days of Peter the Great simply evaporated, undone not by foreign invasion, but by its own decay. When news reached Petrograd, the city erupted in disbelief. Church bells rang, workers embraced in the streets, and soldiers fired their rifles into the air, not in anger, but in celebration. After centuries of autocracy, Russia was, for the first time, a republic. Crowds cheered for freedom, imagining a bright democratic dawn. But even in triumph, shadows gathered. The provisional government promised liberty, yet dared not end the war that had ruined the country. The Petrograd Soviet promised peace, but had no means to deliver it. Two revolutions had begun, one political, one social, and they were destined to collide. As spring returned to the thawing city, the people of Russia felt the warmth of hope for the first time in generations. Yet beneath that fragile optimism, the ground was already trembling again. The fall of the Tsar left behind not a vacuum, but a duel. In Petrograd, two governments emerged, facing one another like reflections in a cracked mirror. One, the provisional government, ruled from elegant ministries and spoke the language of liberal democracy. The other, the Petrograd Soviet, met in smoky halls filled with workers, sailors, and soldiers, its voice carried by the rough cadence of revolution. Between them, power was divided. And so was the nation. The provisional government promised freedom of speech, equality before the law, and elections for a future constituent assembly. Its leaders, men like Alexander Kerensky and Pavel Milyukov, dreamed of a Western-style republic that would preserve Russia's honor and continue the war against Germany. But the soldiers and workers who had spilled blood for bread did not want more speeches. They wanted peace, land, and control of their own lives. The Petrograd Soviet became the embodiment of those demands. Born out of the strikes and chaos of February, it began as a council of delegates. But soon it commanded the loyalty of the garrisons, the factories, and the railways. In March, it issued Order No. 1, decreeing that soldiers were to obey officers only if their commands did not contradict the Soviets' directives. With that single act, the authority of the army, and by extension the provisional government, began to crumble. Into this fragile balance stepped a man who had spent years in exile, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. When his train arrived at Finland Station in April 1917, crowds greeted him as a prophet returned from the wilderness. Thin, intense, his eyes burned with purpose. Within hours, he presented his April theses, a manifesto that rejected the government outright. No support for the provisional government, he declared. All power to the Soviets. To a war-weary nation, his words were electric. Lenin's vision was radical and immediate. End the war, distribute land to peasants, transfer factories to workers, and replace parliamentary democracy with councils of the people. To moderates, he seemed insane, a German agent, perhaps. But to thousands of soldiers and laborers, he offered clarity in chaos. The Bolshevik Party, once a fractured minority, began to swell with new converts drawn by the promise of peace and justice. Meanwhile, the provisional government struggled to keep control. It inherited an empire collapsing under its own weight, soldiers deserting en masse, peasants seizing estates, entire provinces demanding independence. Ministers debated reforms while trains carrying deserters thundered past them. Even within Petrograd, power depended not on decrees but on persuasion, and the Bolsheviks were masters of persuasion. By early summer, the dual power arrangement had become a slow-motion collision. Two Russias existed, one speaking the language of law and compromise, the other of revolution and survival. Between them stretched a nation exhausted by war and betrayal. The question was no longer whether one would fall, but which one would strike first. By the summer of 1917, Russia was slipping toward the edge. The provisional government, desperate to prove its legitimacy to the Allies, launched a new offensive against Germany, a final attempt to show that the revolution had not broken the army. It was called the Kerensky Offensive, named after the charismatic minister who had risen from lawyer to revolutionary hero. For a brief moment, it seemed to succeed. Russian troops advanced across Galicia, bayonets glittering under the sun. But the illusion of unity shattered almost instantly. Within weeks, discipline dissolved. Soldiers mutinied, officers deserted, and entire divisions fled the front. By mid-July, what was meant to be a triumphant offensive had collapsed into chaos. The retreat became a stampede, men streaming back toward Petrograd, terrified, hungry, furious. The failure at the front brought the fury of the war home to the capital, and in the factories and barracks, that anger turned political. On July 16th, the streets of Petrograd erupted again. Armed soldiers, sailors, and workers flooded the city shouting, "All power to the Soviets." The uprising, spontaneous and leaderless, became known as the July Days. The Bolsheviks, caught between opportunity and fear, hesitated. Lenin urged caution. Trotsky tried to channel the crowds, but the movement spun out of control. Shots were fired. Government troops returned to the city. By the time the smoke cleared, hundreds were dead or wounded. The provisional government seized its chance. It branded the Bolsheviks as traitors and German agents, accusing them of plotting to destroy Russia from within. Lenin fled in disguise to Finland, his beard shaved, hiding in barns and back rooms while the press published caricatures of him in a Kaiser's helmet. Trotsky and dozens of Bolshevik leaders were imprisoned. For a moment, it seemed the revolutionaries were finished, their movement broken, their leader gone. But beneath the surface, the government's victory was hollow. The same soldiers who suppressed the uprising still distrusted their officers. Peasants across the countryside continued to seize estates, burning manors and redistributing land. The war dragged on, and morale sank lower with each telegram of casualties. Ministers bickered over policy as the economy collapsed in their hands. In late August, a new crisis struck: the Kornilov affair. General Laver Kornilov, the army's commander-in-chief, believed only military discipline could save Russia. Rumors spread that he planned to march on Petrograd, dissolve the Soviets, and restore order by force. Prime Minister Kerensky, once his ally, panicked. Fearing a coup, he called on the workers and soldiers to defend the revolution. And in doing so, he armed the very Bolshevik militias he had tried to destroy. The coup collapsed almost before it began. Kornilov's troops refused to fight their fellow Russians and surrendered without a battle. But politically, the damage was fatal. Kerensky was now hated by conservatives for betraying Kornilov and despised by revolutionaries for continuing the war. The one force that emerged stronger was the Bolsheviks. Their name now whispered again in factories, in barracks, in every hungry household that had lost faith in all others. By autumn, the air in Petrograd felt electric. The streets buzzed with rumor and fear. The provisional government had survived the July days and Kornilov's coup. But in saving itself, it had handed the Bolsheviks their greatest weapon, the trust of a desperate people. Lenin, still in hiding, wrote to his comrades that the time for patience was over. "History will not forgive delay," he warned. "To hesitate now is to lose everything." The next revolution would not begin with protests, but with an armed uprising. As summer faded into the chill of autumn, Russia's revolution entered its most dangerous phase. The provisional government, battered by failure and consumed by infighting, was ruling a nation that no longer listened. Food vanished from the markets, trains stopped running, wages were worthless, and soldiers arriving from the front clogged the streets of Petrograd, carrying rifles but no loyalty. Each day, the government's authority shrank, and each night, the Bolsheviks' confidence grew. In September, the Bolsheviks captured a majority in both the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets, councils that now commanded the allegiance of the city's garrisons. It was a silent coup of influence. All power to the Soviets was no longer a slogan. It was an expectation. Factories elected Bolshevik committees. Sailors declared for Lenin, and in the villages, peasants took land in the name of the revolution. For millions who had nothing, the Bolsheviks were not yet seen as tyrants, but as deliverance. Lenin, still exiled in Finland, watched events unfold through a fog of secrecy and fear. He disguised himself in a wig and spectacles, writing feverish letters to the party leadership. His words were clear and ruthless. "The time is ripe. Delay means death." Inside the Smolny Institute, a former girls' school now converted into Bolshevik headquarters, the Central Committee debated his call. Some feared civil war. Others feared hesitation more. By October 10th, the decision was made. An armed insurrection would seize the capital. The plan was bold, almost reckless. Trotsky, now freed from prison, became the architect of revolution. As chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, he organized the Military Revolutionary Committee, which quietly placed loyal Red Guards in control of the city's key points: bridges, railways, telegraphs, and arsenals. Every move was disguised as defense against another Kornilov-style coup. But in truth, the noose was tightening around the provisional government. Kerensky, now prime minister, sensed the danger too late. His cabinet fractured, his ministers resigned. Newspapers warned of an impending Bolshevik uprising, but the government's words carried no weight. On the night of November 6th, the Red Guards moved. They crossed Petrograd's bridges under cover of darkness, seizing telegraph stations, banks, and government offices without resistance. The city barely noticed. There was no thunder of artillery, no mobs in the streets, only the quiet, methodical occupation of power. At dawn, the Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, stood encircled. Inside, Kerensky's ministers huddled in the dim light of chandeliers as revolution closed in. That night, Red Guards stormed the palace through broken doors and back corridors. A few shots were fired, a few soldiers fell, and then silence. Power had changed hands almost bloodlessly. By morning, Lenin emerged from hiding and addressed the Congress of Soviets. Comrades, the workers' and peasants' revolution has been accomplished. The room erupted. Outside, Petrograd slept through the birth of a new world. The October Revolution had triumphed with astonishing ease, but its peace would be short-lived. Across the empire, outrage and fear spread faster than any army. From generals in the south to socialists in the north, enemies of the new regime were already gathering. Russia's second revolution was complete. Its civil war was about to begin. In the icy dawn that followed the October uprising, Petrograd was eerily quiet. The streets that had once echoed with gunfire now lay still beneath falling snow. Inside the Smolny Institute, the new masters of Russia worked by candlelight. Lenin, pale and exhausted, signed decrees that dismantled centuries of empire, abolishing private land, erasing aristocratic titles, and nationalizing banks. In a few frantic strokes of a pen, the Bolsheviks sought to erase the past. The Winter Palace, once the heart of imperial power, now stood as a symbol of what had been destroyed. The provisional government's ministers, arrested without ceremony, were locked in the Peter and Paul fortress, the same prison where revolutionaries had once been kept by the Tsar. The irony was not lost on anyone. Yet even as Lenin proclaimed victory, the enormity of the task ahead became clear. The state had been captured, but the country was slipping away. Across Russia, chaos reigned. Railways stopped running. Telephones fell silent. Entire provinces declared independence: Finland, Ukraine, the Caucasus. In the countryside, peasants took matters into their own hands, burning manors and dividing estates long before Lenin's decrees arrived. The revolution that had promised order had instead unleashed anarchy. Inside the new government, a different struggle began. Not between classes, but within the revolution itself. Many socialist parties that had supported the overthrow of the Tsar now recoiled from Bolshevik rule. They accused Lenin of staging not a workers' revolution, but a coup. When the long-promised Constituent Assembly finally met in January 1918, the Bolsheviks found themselves in the minority. Lenin's response was blunt. He dissolved it by force. "We are not bound by bourgeois democracy," he declared. The message was clear. The revolution would not share power. To maintain control, the Bolsheviks created a new weapon, the Cheka, a secret police force with authority to arrest, torture, and execute enemies of the people. It was born in a moment of fear of counter-revolution, of assassination, of betrayal. Yet soon it became something larger, the instrument of a state built on suspicion. Night after night, its agents knocked on doors, dragging away anyone accused of harboring sympathy for the old order. Even within the cities, opposition grew. Government offices emptied as civil servants resigned in protest. Workers' strikes paralyzed factories that had once fueled the revolution. The economy collapsed, and inflation turned money into worthless paper. For many Russians, the dream of liberation had turned into confusion, their lives unchanged except for the flag flying above them. Outside Petrograd, resistance began to organize. Disillusioned officers, conservative politicians, and former Tsarist soldiers gathered in the south, calling for a united and indivisible Russia. They accused the Bolsheviks of betraying the nation, of selling it to Germany. From the frozen forests of Siberia to the plains of Ukraine, old enemies of the revolution were stirring. The Bolsheviks had seized power, but they did not yet possess it. Every decree sparked another rebellion, every victory another enemy. And as 1917 gave way to 1918, a new and darker chapter opened, one not of protest or politics, but of war. The revolution had devoured the empire. Now it would begin to devour itself. As winter deepened over the starving cities of Russia, Lenin faced a brutal truth. The revolution could not survive another war. The exhausted army was dissolving, fronts collapsing, soldiers deserting by the millions. Germany's steel divisions were advancing with cold precision. To save his newborn government, Lenin would have to do the unthinkable, make peace with the enemy. In December 1917, negotiations began in the fortress town of Brest-Litovsk. Across a long table draped in red, Soviet delegates, led by Leon Trotsky, faced the uniformed representatives of the German Empire. The contrast was striking. The Germans polished and disciplined, the Russians ragged and defiant, wearing workers' coats and mismatched boots. Their task was impossible: to end a war that Russia had already lost without surrendering its soul. Trotsky tried to delay, hoping revolution would soon spread to Germany itself. His strategy was summed up in a phrase: no war, no peace. But Berlin had no patience for slogans. In February 1918, the German army simply advanced, capturing cities without resistance. Within 5 days, they had marched 150 miles deeper into Russia. Panic spread through Petrograd. Lenin warned that the revolution was about to be strangled in its cradle. On March 3, 1918, the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, one of the harshest peace treaties in modern history. Russia ceded a quarter of its territory, nearly half its population, and 3/4 of its iron and steel production. Ukraine, Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states were lost. To many socialists, it was treason. To Lenin, it was survival. "We must close the wound," he said, "so the body can heal." But the wound only widened. Within days, protests erupted across the country. Leftist revolutionaries, the very allies who had helped the Bolsheviks seize power, denounced the treaty as a betrayal of international socialism. Peace, they argued, had been bought with Russia's soul. Many broke away from the government, leaving Lenin increasingly isolated within his own revolution. At the same time, foreign powers took advantage of the chaos. The Ottoman Empire advanced into the Caucasus. Romania seized Bessarabia. German officers occupied Ukrainian cities and controlled the flow of grain. In the north, British Marines landed at Murmansk, followed soon by French and American troops. Officially, they came to protect supply depots and reopen the Eastern Front. In reality, they came to keep Bolshevism from spreading. The treaty that was meant to bring peace instead drew the world deeper into Russia's turmoil. For the first time in centuries, the empire was carved into spheres of influence by foreign soldiers. Japanese in Vladivostok, Americans in Arkhangelsk, Germans in Kiev. The revolution that had promised to end imperial domination had become its latest victim. Inside Petrograd, the mood darkened. Hunger worsened. Rations dwindled to crumbs. The currency collapsed, forcing people to barter for survival. The workers who had fought for bread now lined up for hours in the cold, clutching ration cards with nothing to buy. Disillusionment spread like frost through every factory and barracks. Lenin, unshaken, told his comrades that this humiliation was temporary, that Russia needed time to rebuild, to reforge itself under a new socialist order. Yet across the frozen steppes, others were preparing to challenge him. Among them were men who saw in the treaty not peace, but treachery. Men determined to reclaim Russia's honor, even if it meant plunging the country into civil war. The Peace of Brest-Litovsk had saved the revolution's body, but its soul was now in open rebellion. The ink on the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had barely dried when Russia began to fracture completely. Across its endless plains, rebellion took shape in dozens of forms: monarchists, liberals, socialists, nationalists, all united by one shared belief: the Bolsheviks had betrayed Russia. Out of this chaos rose the White Movement, a coalition of the defeated and the desperate, determined to crush Lenin's fragile regime. The first spark came from an unlikely source: the Czechoslovak Legion, a force of former POWs stranded along the Trans-Siberian Railway. These men had once fought for the Tsar, then for the Allies, and now simply wanted to go home through Vladivostok. But when Bolshevik officials tried to disarm them in May 1918, skirmishes erupted. The Legion seized train stations, rail depots, and entire stretches of Siberia. Within weeks, they controlled thousands of miles of railway, the steel spine of the empire. Their revolt inspired a wave of anti-Bolshevik uprisings. In the Volga region, former officers and local councils declared new governments. In Samara, a committee of members of the Constituent Assembly claimed to restore democracy. In Omsk, a Siberian administration formed with quiet Allied support. And in the south, generals gathered the remnants of the old imperial army, giving birth to the volunteer army under the command of General Mikhail Alexeyev and the battle-hardened Anton Denikin. To the outside world, the conflict looked less like a civil war and more like a continent unraveling. The Allied powers, fearful of Bolshevism and eager to reopen an eastern front against Germany, began sending troops into Russia. British soldiers landed at Murmansk, French contingents at Arkhangelsk, Japanese divisions in Vladivostok, and American Marines scattered across Siberia. Officially, they came to secure stockpiles of weapons, but in truth, they came to keep the revolution contained. By mid-1918, Russia was no longer one country, but a map of competing powers. The Red Army, hastily formed under Trotsky, controlled Moscow and Petrograd, the heart of the revolution. The Whites held the outer provinces, their banners scattered across Siberia, the Caucasus, and the Don. Between them stretched vast no-man's lands ruled by local warlords, anarchists, and nationalist militias. The old empire had shattered into a mosaic of violence. For the Bolsheviks, the danger was existential. The young Soviet state was encircled by enemies, and the spirit of counter-revolution was spreading fast. In the south, Cossack hosts rose in rebellion, their horsemen thundering across the steppe under the cry of "For faith, Tsar, and fatherland." In the Volga, peasant militias joined the Whites, furious at Bolshevik grain requisitions. Even within Red-held territory, uprisings flared nightly. And yet, in this chaos, the Bolsheviks adapted with terrifying speed. Trotsky reorganized the Red Army from a mob of volunteers into a disciplined fighting machine. He reintroduced ranks, imposed strict discipline, and even recruited former Tsarist officers, men who only months earlier had sworn loyalty to the crown. They served under the watchful eyes of Bolshevik commissars who carried pistols and orders to shoot any sign of betrayal. "We need specialists," Lenin declared. "We will use them and then control them." As summer burned into autumn, the Civil War's front lines hardened. Red banners fluttered over Moscow and Petrograd, while white flags flew across the steppe and Siberia. Between them, villages were burned, cities bombarded, and trains filled with refugees choked the rails. The world watched in fascination and horror. For many in the West, this was not just a Russian struggle, but a glimpse into the future, a war between two visions of civilization. To the Bolsheviks, it was simpler. History had drawn its battle lines. The old Russia had returned to reclaim its throne, and they would drown it in blood if they had to. From the ashes of empire, a new kind of war had begun, total, merciless, and without mercy for victors or victims. By 1918, the revolution's promise of liberation had dissolved into something darker. The Bolsheviks now ruled a country consumed by war, famine, and fear, and to survive, they turned to terror. What had begun as a struggle for social justice hardened into a system of control unlike anything Russia had ever known. The assassination attempts came first. In late August, Fanya Kaplan, a former socialist revolutionary, ambushed Lenin outside a Moscow factory, firing 3 shots into his chest and shoulder. He survived, barely. That same week, the Bolshevik leader Moisei Uritsky was murdered in Petrograd. To Lenin's government, these were not isolated attacks, but a conspiracy of counter-revolutionaries, monarchists, and foreign agents. The response was swift and merciless, the beginning of the Red Terror. Under Felix Dzerzhinsky, the secret police, the Cheka, spread through every province. Suspected enemies of the revolution were rounded up by the thousands. Trials were rare, executions common. Entire prisons were emptied into shallow graves. Others became concentration camps guarded by men with blank faces and red armbands. The new regime claimed the violence was necessary, a purging fire to defend the revolution. But for millions, it felt like the birth of a nightmare. Yet the terror did not belong to one side alone. In the territories held by the white armies, vengeance burned just as fiercely. Anti-Bolshevik forces carried out pogroms against Jews and massacres of workers suspected of sympathy with the Reds. In Ukraine alone, over 200,000 civilians were murdered in the chaos. Villages changed hands repeatedly, each new army leaving fresh graves behind. As one historian would later write, the Russian Civil War was fought by men who had forgotten what peace looked like. Meanwhile, the economy collapsed entirely. Factories stood silent, machines rusting, railways disintegrated under snow and neglect. The ruble became worthless, and trade reverted to barter. Facing starvation, the Bolsheviks turned to war communism, a desperate experiment in total control. All industries were nationalized, strikes outlawed, and private trade banned. Food was requisitioned directly from the peasants to feed the Red Army and the cities. Those who resisted had their villages burned. Those who hid their grain were branded as enemies of the state. The policy saved the army but starved the countryside. Millions of peasants buried their harvests or slaughtered their livestock rather than surrender it. Entire provinces rebelled, only to be crushed by red detachments. "Comrade, you cannot make bread from bayonets," one peasant shouted before he was shot. Still, Lenin persisted, convinced that the revolution could not afford compassion. "We are not fighting against individuals," he said. "We are exterminating a class." Trotsky, now Commissar of War, forged the Red Army into a force both feared and disciplined. Traveling the front lines in his armored train, he executed deserters on the spot and reinstated former Tsarist officers to command. Behind them marched political commissars to ensure loyalty. Through propaganda and sheer brutality, he transformed chaos into structure. By early 1919, the Red Army numbered over 3 million men, a state within a state. In Petrograd and Moscow, the ideology of the revolution hardened under siege. Newspapers spoke of eternal vigilance, of class war, of enemies everywhere. Posters showed heroic workers crushing hydra-headed serpents labeled bourgeois, priest, kulak, spy. The rhetoric of liberation had given way to the language of survival. But beneath the slogans, Russia was dying. Famine spread through the Volga. Disease followed the armies. Children disappeared into orphaned streets. The revolution that had promised a radiant future now marched through a land of ash and corpses, sustained only by fear, faith, and the unshakable belief that its suffering had meaning. The Red Terror and war communism had saved Lenin's government from collapse, but at a terrible cost. What had begun as a war for freedom was now a war for dominance. The revolution had survived, but Russia itself was bleeding out. By the winter of 1918 to 1919, the vast snows of Siberia hid an empire within an empire, a new Russia rising under white banners. Here, amid frozen railways and half-starved garrisons, the anti-Bolshevik cause found its would-be savior, Admiral Alexander Kolchak. Once a polar explorer and commander of the Imperial Navy, Kolchak was disciplined, pious, and ruthless. Everything the fractured white movement thought it needed. When a coup in Omsk overthrew the fledgling Siberian government, Kolchak stepped from his quarters into the night, accepted power, and declared himself supreme ruler of Russia. To his followers, it was an oath of redemption. To his enemies, a death sentence. Under Kolchak, the white forces unified, at least on paper. Allied powers, eager to crush Bolshevism before it spread, funneled weapons and supplies through Vladivostok. British and American troops guarded the rails, while Japanese divisions occupied the far eastern ports. For a moment, it seemed the tide might turn. The Red Army, stretched thin across a dozen fronts, appeared vulnerable. In early 1919, Kolchak struck. His armies advanced westward through the endless snow, retaking towns along the Volga and capturing the city of Kazan, and with it, the Imperial Gold Reserve, hundreds of tons of bullion once owned by the Tsars. It was a symbolic victory, Russia's royal gold in anti-Bolshevik hands. In those same months, the world learned of another, far darker event. In Yekaterinburg, where the white advance threatened Bolshevik lines, the Romanov family, Nicholas II, his wife, and their 5 children were taken into a basement and executed. Bullets, bayonets, and fire ended 3 centuries of monarchy. Their bodies were burned and buried in the forest. The Reds called it justice, the Whites called it murder. But Kolchak's triumphs were brittle. His officers quarreled, his allies distrusted him, and his soldiers, peasants conscripted by force, deserted in droves. For every mile the Whites gained, their discipline eroded. Brutal reprisals followed each capture. Suspected Reds hanged from lampposts, villages looted, Jews massacred in pogroms. Kolchak's rule, meant to restore order, became a reign of vengeance. In the south and west, other white generals refused his command altogether. Anton Denikin, Nikolai Yudnich, Pyotr Wrangel. Each fought their own war, each claiming to fight for Russia, though none could agree on what Russia meant. The Red Army, by contrast, was learning. Trotsky's reforms were bearing fruit. Trains ferried men and munitions from Moscow to every front. Commissars enforced unity with cold precision. The Reds now held the industrial heartland, the rail hubs, and the vast reserves of manpower. Their propaganda painted the Whites as foreign puppets, a message that resonated in a country still haunted by invasion. Even starving peasants preferred Bolshevik tyranny to the return of landlords. As spring thawed into mud, Kolchak's offensive began to unravel. His supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of frozen wilderness. Locomotives froze on their tracks. Ammunition ran out. Men mutinied. Red counterattacks struck like fire through dry grass. By autumn, the Siberian front collapsed. Kolchak's troops retreated eastward through a wasteland of ice and corpses, a death march known later as the Great Siberian Ice March. In the chaos, the Czechoslovak Legion, still guarding the Trans-Siberian Railway, turned against him. They captured Kolchak and, in exchange for safe passage home, handed him to the local Soviet authorities. On a freezing February morning in 1920, the admiral was led to the riverbank in Irkutsk and shot. His body sank beneath the ice and was never recovered. Siberia fell silent again, its snow covering the bones of armies and the last illusions of the old Russia. The supreme ruler was gone. The gold vanished. The dream of a white restoration melted into the same frost that had consumed his soldiers. Yet in the south, another storm was rising, one that would carry the war to the very gates of Moscow. While Kolchak's empire of ice crumbled in the east, a new white offensive gathered strength in the south. The Don and Kuban plains, lands of horsemen and endless steppe, became the heart of the anti-Bolshevik crusade. Here, under banners embroidered with eagles and crosses, fought the volunteer army, led by General Anton Denikin. A veteran of the Great War, Denikin was pragmatic where Kolchak had been idealistic. But like all the white leaders, he carried the fatal burden of division. By mid-1919, the Whites held nearly 1 million square kilometers across southern Russia and Ukraine. Their ranks were a strange brotherhood. Monarchists dreaming of the old Tsar, liberals demanding a republic, and Cossack hosts fighting for their own independence. They were united only by hatred of the Reds. With British tanks, French ammunition, and Allied gold, Denikin prepared his boldest move yet, a march on Moscow itself. In June, the offensive began. Cavalry thundered northward through the steppe, sabers glinting beneath a merciless sun. White forces swept through Kharkov and Orel, capturing key rail lines. In the west, General Nikolai Yudnich, commanding the Northwestern Army, advanced from Estonia toward Petrograd, backed by the British Royal Navy. Within weeks, two white armies, one from the south, one from the north, were converging on the heart of Bolshevik Russia. The Red capital trembled. For Lenin and Trotsky, it was the gravest crisis of the war. Trotsky rushed from front to front aboard his armored train, rallying troops and shooting deserters. In Petrograd, panic spread as Yudnich's forces came within 15 miles of the city. Even the chairman of the local Soviet suffered a nervous collapse. Trotsky took command personally, fortifying bridges and mustering Red Guards from factories and shipyards. In desperate speeches, he invoked the revolution's survival. Behind us, Petrograd, the cradle of freedom, not one step backward. The defense was ferocious. Women joined workers on the barricades. Sailors from Kronstadt shelled the advancing Whites. And then, just as Petrograd braced for annihilation, Yudnich's offensive stalled. His supply lines stretched too far, his allies in Estonia withdrew support, and his soldiers, exhausted and unpaid, melted away. By late October, the Red Army counterattacked, driving him back into exile. Petrograd, bruised but unbroken, remained in Bolshevik hands. Meanwhile, Denikin's grand offensive in the south faltered as well. At first, his forces seemed unstoppable, pushing north until the red banners over Moscow were within reach. Panic swept the Bolshevik ranks. Lenin prepared evacuation plans. But the Whites were overextended. Their armies, advancing hundreds of miles across devastated terrain, began to disintegrate. Cossacks deserted to protect their homelands. Peasants, angered by forced requisitions and the return of landlords, turned against them. The same peasants the Whites sought to liberate now ambushed their convoys in the night. By autumn, the tide turned. The Red Cavalry, newly formed under the brilliant and brutal Semyon Budyonny, struck at Denikin's flanks with terrifying speed. Town after town fell, railway junctions cut, supply depots captured. The volunteer army, once a disciplined force, became a fleeing mass. By the year's end, Denikin's troops were retreating toward the Black Sea, pursued by the relentless Red advance. In the south, flames consumed villages. In the north, frozen corpses lined the roads. The white dream of a united and indivisible Russia was collapsing on every front. Yet in their defeat, the Whites left scars that would never heal. Their pogroms, executions, and excesses convinced even neutral peasants that a Red victory, however cruel, was preferable to the old order's return. By early 1920, Denikin resigned his command, his army shattered. He handed leadership to a younger, more disciplined general, Pyotr Wrangel, known as the Black Baron. Wrangel was calm, intelligent, and incorruptible. Under his command, the remnants of the White Army would make one final stand on the peninsula of Crimea, a fortress surrounded by sea and memory. As winter returned to Russia, the war was far from over, but the momentum, once on the side of the old world, had shifted irrevocably to the new. The revolution had survived its greatest trial. The empire of the Reds was beginning to rise. While the Red and White armies tore Russia apart, a third force rose from the black soil of Ukraine, a movement that fought for neither empire nor ideology, but for freedom itself. Its leader was Nestor Makhno, a wiry peasant with dark, piercing eyes and a bandit's charisma. To his followers, he was Batko, Father Makhno, the son of a serf who had turned his hunger into rebellion. Born from the ashes of rural despair, Makhno's revolutionary insurgent army of Ukraine, known as the Black Army, began as a handful of guerrillas resisting both the Germans who occupied Ukraine after Brest-Litovsk and the landlords who returned under white protection. Their symbol was a black banner stitched with the words, "Death to all who stand in the way of freedom." Within a year, their numbers swelled into tens of thousands. On fast-moving horse carts armed with machine guns, the Tachanka, Makhno's forces struck like lightning across the steppe, vanishing before the enemy could react. Makhno's vision was neither Bolshevik dictatorship nor Tsarist restoration. In the territory he controlled, a vast region known as Makhnovia, peasants governed themselves through free councils, or soviets, independent of central authority. Land was redistributed, factories run collectively, and schools opened for the first time in generations. In these brief months, anarchism became more than theory. It was lived, chaotic, and fleetingly real. Yet utopias born of war rarely last. The Bolsheviks, needing Makhno's cavalry to fight Denikin and later Wrangel, allied with him when convenient and denounced him when not. Mutual suspicion ran deep. Red commissars viewed the anarchists as undisciplined and dangerous. Makhno saw the Bolsheviks as tyrants hiding behind socialist slogans. Between battles, their uneasy alliance broke and reformed again, a dance of necessity amid betrayal. In the autumn of 1919, when Denikin's white forces advanced deep into Ukraine, Makhno's guerrillas became the Red Army's salvation. In a daring raid near Peregonovka, Makhno's men struck Denikin's rear, cutting off his supply lines and forcing his retreat. It was one of the most decisive blows of the war, yet Moscow gave no thanks. When the Whites were broken, the Reds turned their guns on their former allies. The campaign against the anarchists was relentless. The Cheka infiltrated villages. Red detachments burned towns that refused to surrender. Makhno, hunted and betrayed, resorted to hit-and-run warfare once again. The ideals that had once inspired his movement, self-rule, equality, freedom, began to drown in blood and exhaustion. Even his own commanders grew cruel, enforcing revolutionary justice at gunpoint. Like the larger war itself, the Makhnovist experiment devoured the hope that created it. By 1921, the end had come. Pursued across the Dnieper, Makhno led a final handful of followers into exile across the Romanian border. Behind him, Ukraine smoldered, villages in ruins, fields unplowed, a generation lost to war. The brief flicker of libertarian revolution was extinguished beneath the iron heel of the Bolshevik state. For a fleeting moment, amidst the collapse of empires and ideologies, Makhno had carved out a land without masters, a republic of peasants who answered to no one but themselves. Yet like so much of Russia's revolution, it was swallowed by the same storm that had given it birth. The anarchists were gone. Only the Reds and the dying Whites remained, and the final battle for Russia's soul would be fought where the land met the sea, on the blinding shores of Crimea. By 1920, the Russian Civil War had narrowed to its last bloodiest front. The shattered remnants of the White movement, exhausted, cornered but unbroken, retreated south to the Crimean Peninsula, led by their final commander, General Pyotr Wrangel, the Black Baron. Tall, reserved, and severe, Wrangel was unlike his predecessors. Where Denikin had been chaotic, Kolchak idealistic, Wrangel was methodical and disciplined, a soldier who still believed that Russia could be saved through honor. Crimea, surrounded by the Black Sea and guarded by narrow isthmuses, became his fortress. There, Wrangel rebuilt what was left of the White Army, some 30,000 men, and governed the peninsula with a mix of military order and reform. Unlike other white leaders, he understood that victory required more than force. It required the hearts of the people. He abolished the death penalty for desertion, forbade looting, promised land reform, and offered amnesty to peasants who had fought for the Reds. For a brief moment, Wrangel's Crimea became a haven of stability amid the ruins of Russia. But beyond the peninsula, the world was moving on. The Allied powers, once vocal in their support of the Whites, were weary of intervention. The Great War had ended, and their publics demanded withdrawal. One by one, foreign troops departed. French ships left the Black Sea. British officers packed their crates. Only the Japanese lingered in the Far East, pursuing their own ambitions. Wrangel's army stood alone, proud, hungry, and encircled. At the same time, a new war exploded in the West. The Polish-Soviet War drew the Red Army into another brutal campaign. In early 1920, Polish forces, allied with Ukrainian nationalists, seized Kiev and advanced deep into Ukraine. For the Bolsheviks, it was a moment of humiliation, until a miraculous reversal came at the Battle of Warsaw. The Polish offensive collapsed, and the Reds, now victorious, turned their full might back toward the south. Wrangel's respite was over. That autumn, the Red Army, under the command of Mikhail Frunze, crossed the Dnieper in overwhelming numbers. Wrangel struck first, launching a desperate counteroffensive into northern Tavria, briefly capturing ground and rekindling hope among his weary men. For weeks, his cavalry harassed Red supply lines, his officers dreaming that perhaps, just perhaps, a stalemate might lead to foreign recognition or aid. But the Reds had learned the art of war too well. With the precision of a machine, Frunze's forces counterattacked, driving Wrangel's army back toward the narrow gates of Crimea. Then nature itself betrayed them. Heavy storms swept across the Perekop Isthmus, flattening defenses and revealing hidden crossings through the marshes. Through this breach poured waves of Red infantry, armored trains, and cavalry. For 10 relentless days they fought hand-to-hand across sand dunes and frozen shallows, bayonets glinting in the storm. The Whites, outnumbered 4-1, could no longer hold. On November 14, 1920, Wrangel gave the order: evacuation. In the harbors of Sevastopol, Yalta, and Feodosia, ships of every size filled with soldiers, refugees, and the remnants of the old Russia. Families clutched icons and suitcases. Priests whispered final prayers. As the fleet pulled away, Wrangel stood on the deck of his flagship, watching the coastline disappear into the mist. Behind them, red banners rose over the ports, and the executions began. Thousands who could not flee were rounded up, officers, priests, intellectuals, and shot along the beaches. In Sevastopol alone, the waves turned red for days. The peninsula that had once been the last sanctuary of the old Russia became its grave. Wrangel's fleet sailed across the Black Sea to Constantinople, exiles carrying a vanished world. The dream of restoring the Tsar, the Duma, or even a free Russia was over. The Civil War's final white flame had been extinguished. Yet for the Bolsheviks, victory brought no peace. Behind the lines, rebellion still smoldered, peasants starving under war communism, sailors plotting mutiny, entire provinces rising once more. The guns had not fallen silent. They had only turned inward. Russia had been saved from her enemies and delivered into the hands of her own. The guns fell silent, but peace did not come. Russia was a country without pulse or direction, a wasteland of corpses, orphans, and ash. Villages once filled with song now lay in silence, their fields scorched, their wells poisoned. In the wake of victory, Lenin's government faced not celebration, but ruin. The empire had died. The revolution had survived. Barely. What remained was hunger. War communism, the system that had fed the Red Army, now starved the people. Grain requisitions continued even after the fighting ended, stripping the countryside bare. Peasants buried their harvests or slaughtered their livestock rather than surrender them. In the Volga region, drought compounded disaster. Entire provinces turned into skeletal landscapes where millions withered and died. Cannibalism was whispered about, denied officially but known by all. By 1921, Russia was a graveyard, its population reduced by famine, disease, and execution alike. Desperation soon became defiance. Across Tambov, the Urals, and Siberia, peasant uprisings flared again, led by former Red soldiers who had grown disillusioned with the very revolution they had bled for. The largest, the Tambov Rebellion, gathered tens of thousands under arms, demanding an end to requisitions and the right to live free upon our own land. The Bolsheviks responded with unrelenting fury. Under Mikhail Tukhachevsky's command, the Red Army crushed the revolt using artillery, mass deportations, and, in a chilling new precedent, chemical weapons. Poison gas drifted over the same villages that once fed the revolution. In the cities, discontent took another form. Workers who had supported the Bolsheviks now rioted against them, demanding bread and free elections. Even the soldiers and sailors of Kronstadt, once heroes of the revolution, rose in rebellion. "Soviets without Bolsheviks!" they shouted, hoisting black flags over their fortress. For Lenin, it was betrayal of the deepest kind. "They were our pride," Trotsky lamented, and then gave the order to attack. The bombardment of Kronstadt was relentless. Ice on the Gulf of Finland shattered under shell fire as Red troops advanced across the frozen sea. After 10 days of brutal fighting, the fortress fell. Thousands of sailors were executed. Thousands more fled across the ice into exile. The rebellion's last words, written before the final assault, read simply, "We fight for the true ideals of October." Even as rebellions burned out, the land itself rebelled. Epidemics of typhus and cholera swept through towns. Entire trains became plague wagons, their passengers dying mid-journey. In Moscow, Lenin's face, once radiant with conviction, grew gaunt. He had won a civil war, but at the cost of a civilization. The revolution's children were starving, its veterans broken, its ideals stained in blood. Yet, even amid ruin, the machinery of the new state hardened. The Cheka became the GPU, more organized, more pervasive. Censorship replaced debate. Prisons replaced arguments. The government justified every cruelty as necessity. "We are laying the foundation," Lenin said quietly. "One must build with whatever materials one has, even blood." By 1921, the Bolsheviks recognized that the terror could not feed the people. War communism was replaced with the new economic policy, a temporary retreat that allowed limited private trade and small markets. It was a concession to survival, a whisper of capitalism in a land that had tried to abolish it. Slowly, famine eased. Grain returned to the cities, but the cost of that reprieve was memory. The people learned to obey in silence. The Civil War had ended, yet the struggle for Russia's soul continued, in whispers, in prisons, in the quiet fear of those who had seen too much. The revolution had destroyed its enemies. Now it would begin to destroy itself. And in that silence between wars, amid the ashes of the dead and the flicker of a fading dream, a new empire, red and unyielding, began to rise from the ruins of the old. By the winter of 1922, Russia no longer resembled the empire that had entered the Great War 8 years earlier. The palaces were stripped bare, the railways broken, the countryside reduced to hunger and ghosts. Yet from this ruin, something new and terrible was being forged. The Bolsheviks had not merely survived, they had reshaped the very idea of the Russian state. In December of that year, delegates gathered in Moscow to formalize the revolution's final creation, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. It was presented as a federation of equals, but everyone knew where true power lay. Moscow had replaced St. Petersburg. The party had replaced the Tsar. The red banner that fluttered above the Kremlin was not the end of tyranny. It was its reincarnation, draped in the language of liberation. Lenin, worn down by illness and strokes, ruled more from bed than from the rostrum. His body was failing, but his will remained unbent. "We have paid a terrible price," he admitted to aides, "but we have preserved the revolution." Around him, men like Trotsky, Stalin, and Dzerzhinsky circled, loyal for now, but already calculating. The Civil War had taught them that power could be maintained only through fear and discipline. Ideals had given way to institutions, and those institutions were made of iron. The human cost defied imagination. Between 1917 and 1922, as many as 10 million people perished. Not only soldiers, but civilians, peasants, children. Some died from bullets, many more from hunger and disease. Entire generations vanished into mass graves or exile. Cities like Kazan and Kharkov became skeletal husks. In the villages, the peasants who once cheered for land reform now labored under new masters, their grain seized in the name of the proletariat. Yet for all its devastation, the Civil War had done something extraordinary. It had centralized power more completely than any czar had ever managed. The revolution's chaos had killed off rivals, monarchists, liberals, anarchists, even rival socialists, leaving the Bolsheviks alone atop a mountain of ashes. From Petrograd's empty streets to the far reaches of Siberia, there was now only one flag, one party, one truth. The dream of freedom had become the architecture of control. Abroad, the world watched with fascination and dread. To some, the Soviet Union appeared as a dark miracle, a workers' state born from the corpse of empire. To others, it was a warning that idealism, once armed, can become indistinguishable from tyranny. The revolution that promised to liberate humanity had taught humanity how revolutions die. As 1923 dawned, Lenin's health failed completely. He was carried through the Kremlin corridors like a relic, half-conscious, dictating his final notes. In them, he warned against the rising figure of Joseph Stalin, a man he described as too rude and dangerous for power. But his words came too late. Within a year, Lenin would be dead, embalmed and displayed like a saint in the mausoleum that still bears his name. The system he built, the machinery of state, terror, and ideology, would live on. And so, from the ashes of the czars and the corpses of the revolution, the Soviet Union was born. Not as the utopia its founders had promised, but as a new kind of empire, secular, industrial, and absolute. It would rise from famine to superpower, from revolution to dictatorship, carrying within it the same contradictions that had destroyed every regime before it. The Russian Civil War had ended, but its echoes never did. Its ghosts lingered in the prisons, the parades, the speeches, and the silences of the decades that followed. It was the crucible that remade the modern world, proof that out of ruin, even monsters can be born. In the frozen heart of Moscow, the red flag rippled against the wind, no longer a banner of revolution, but the standard of an empire reborn.